The news is in, and Tyrese Haliburton's going to miss a few weeks for the Pacers. Not the worst news, but not good news, certainly, for the Pacers who were rolling prior to this injury. We'll talk about the injury, how long Tyrese could be out for the Pacers, what it means on the court, and who will need to step up, and if it'll change the Pacers' plans heading into this trade deadline, all on today's Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today, the Pacers' big first injury of the season. Second, I should say. Chris Duarte was hurt early in the season, but most impactful, certainly on the court. Tyrese Haliburton will miss more than 1 week, maybe more than 2 weeks, depending on a reevaluation with an elbow and knee injury. We'll dive into the injury itself, what it means, how long he could be out for, what it means for the Pacers on the floor. We'll talk in the second segment about who needs to step up, what it could mean for the team's play style, how the lineups could shift. There's a lot to dive into as well, because there's other guys who are also hurt at the same time. And at the end of the show today, we'll talk about what it could mean for the trade look ahead for the Pacers. Deadline in a month, less than a month now. What does this mean for that? Could it change the Pacers' plans at all? But of course, we start with the injury itself. Yesterday, we only had what Carlisle said after the game and video of the injury itself. Today, the Pacers announced at about 5 o'clock, a little bit beforehand, that I will just read the press release verbatim. The Indiana Pacers announced on Thursday that guard Tyrese Haliburton suffered a left elbow sprain and mild left knee bone contusion during the third quarter of last night's game at New York. He underwent an MRI this afternoon on his elbow and knee in Indianapolis, and the team is awaiting additional opinion on the results of those scans. Haliburton will be reevaluated in approximately 2 weeks, and updates will be provided as appropriate. Number one, biggest takeaway, obviously, with something like a knee that requires you to leave a game and be on crutches, no ligaments. Knee bone contusion, knee bruise. That's no ligaments. That's good news. That is thumbs up, good news. That's my big takeaway. I was going to, personally, my first thought was, is this a ligament thing? Is this a long-term thing? And barring those second opinions, changing drastically what is said in this press release, it sounds like no ligaments. That is good. The elbow thing is surprising. I have no idea which one of these injuries is the one that will be the driver of this timeline between the elbow and the knee, but a double injury on Tyrese Haliburton's left side of his body, and he's out for, let's be clear, this is reevaluated in 2 weeks, which could mean he's only out for 2 weeks. That could also mean he's out for 2 weeks, and then he'll get another evaluation that says he's out for longer. For example, when Kendall Brown was originally announced as out with his tibia injury last month, it was reevaluated in a few weeks, and he's been out ever since. You never know with these reevaluation things how this works. So this is, again, I would say in the grand scheme of things, good news, not season ending or anything like that. At least it doesn't look like it right this second. But of course, obviously, the headliner, devastating. The headline beyond the ligaments, devastating for the Pacers, because they're going to be without their best player for multiple weeks and for 1/10 or more of their season, right? And I say 1/10 because if you just get the 2 week period before the next reevaluation, let's say in 2 weeks from now, today is the 12th that I'm talking, that the reevaluation in 2 weeks goes perfect and he's ready to go. So that would be the 26th of this month. The Pacers play 8 games between now and the 26th, and they're a pretty tough run of opponents. Hawks, Grizzlies, Bucks, Thunder, Nuggets, Suns, Bulls, Magic in that stretch. And then immediately after, it's Bucks, Grizzlies, Lakers, Kings, Cavs, Heat, Suns. Like, their schedule really between now and the All-Star break, they play the Bulls, Wizards, and Jazz right before the break, which is pretty easy. And like I said, they've got that one Orlando Magic game in there, but pretty tough in general from now to the break, which is about a month away. So if the reevaluation takes them through there, that's obviously concerning. But 8 games I picked because that is the number of games in the 2 weeks that before the reevaluation period, and is 1/10 of the season if you think of an 82-game season. And it's a tough stretch of games. A road trip mixed in there, 6 out of the next 8 on the road, 4 in a row on the road after the home back-to-back the Pacers have this coming weekend. Like, it's a tough run of games coming up, and the Pacers will be without their engine, their driver, their leader on and off the court in Tyrese Haliburton, which is obviously terrible for them. And the stats do decent justice here. Look, you look at the on-off numbers, Pacers better with him on than off. Their offense goes from a 110.9 106.9 offensive rating to a 116.5 when he's out there. That's a 5.5-point offensive rating difference for a team that is one of the better offensive teams in the entire NBA. He's the one that makes them go. And I think, when you think about the Pacers, who average, mid-20s in assists per game, Haliburton's 40% of those. And he has the ball a lot. Of course, he's going to get more assists than other guys, but he sets up everyone else for success. And so this sort of impact isn't just take away Tyrese Haliburton's impact, and there you go. You figured out how much worse the Pacers are going to be. No. Everyone else who plays with him is better because they play with him. Miles Turner's having the best season of his career because he's playing with one of the best passers. He's playing with the best passer he's ever played with. A lot of these guys, that sort of thing is the case. Some other guys are thriving because they're playing in a fast-paced system. That Tyrese Haliburton is the leader of, the engineer of, the whatever you want to call it. This is the fewest. Rick Carlisle has kind of described the fewest play calls he's had to make his whole career. That's because Tyrese Haliburton is out there running the show, trafficking the offense, all those sorts of things. That's not the case anymore. We'll dive into what the point guard rotation, the Pacers guard situation could look like in the second segment. But you get the idea that in the immediate, yes, the losses, you can look at the numbers and say they're 6 points worse per 100 possessions on offense without him. But it's not just about that. It's about everyone else having to do more offensively to keep up. And in turn, now being more exhausted on the defensive end, the rotations are going to change so much. It's not just totally fair to look at a healthy rotation on-off numbers. There's a lot of layers to this. And this is going to be really, really tough for the Pacers. They've built their identity around fast offense, rapid offense with good reads and all sorts of, I've heard the term random action said by a few people on the team. It's harder to do that without the guy who can read the defense at the level he does and make all of that happen. Sure, there are other 2 point guards who will play, are also smart, talented passers, but not to the level of Haliburton, who is one of the best passers in the entire NBA. So that's obviously a significant loss for the blue and gold. We'll see how long he's out past the reevaluation period. I think that is where this story will take the biggest turn for the Pacers season, right? If he misses the rest of this month, for example, 10, 12, 14 games, that's tough, but survivable, right? Other guys will step up. Like you can manage a stretch without your best player. It won't go well, but even the Warriors are doing okay with that. Did okay. It's over now without Steph Curry. They didn't do well. They obviously were way worse than the Warriors with Steph, but they survived, right? Everybody else has to step up and finds ways to be better. I think the Pacers will have some of that, but it's going to be a lot harder for those guys to be better because they're missing the guy who makes them play their best. Now, the other part of this I wanted to dig into, and this is a 2017 article, but if you don't know who Jeff Stotts is, he publishes InStreetClothes.com, perhaps the best coverage of injuries in the NBA. And he wrote one in 2017. I think this is the most recent one I could find about a knee contusion in a knee. It was about Rudy Gobert, who hyperextended his knee and had a bone contusion back in 2017. But he wrote about, what the injury is and what it entails. The final paragraph here has some similar takeaways to me, but also has the numbers that you guys might care about more. It says, while Gobert avoided ligament damage, bone contusions remain significant injuries that require time to appropriately heal. There were 14 cases of them in the NBA last season, including Gobert's teammates. The big sentence for Pacers fans, though, the recovery time varied widely from case to case, but the average missed time was 20 days or 12.2 games lost per incident. That's about 3 weeks. But that is, again, the average. And he describes in the article how the contusion can be based on different parts of the leg and how that varies how long it can be. So without knowing that information, it's impossible to say. But if you just want to use the average to set your own baseline in your head of how long the Pacers will be without Haliburton, 20 days is that number. That takes you into early February, for example, for the Pacers. They play the Lakers at home on February 2nd. That would keep Haliburton out for the next 10 games. They play a back-to-back. They play on the 3rd as well. You get the idea. They have a big gap between their game on the 5th against Cleveland and then the 8th in Miami. All this stuff where, there's, if you want to go on the average timeline, maybe those are the days you look at. But again, without knowing these specifics, the mechanics, and look, you're hearing me on a podcast. I'm not a doctor. That this is just the estimations I can give you with publicly available information. But the headline, Pacers are going to be worse. How can they recover? Who needs to step up? All sorts of important things to note on that front. Let's dive into that in the second segment here today. Guys like TJ McConnell, Andrew Nembhard, Benedict Mathurin. Who's going to start now for the Pacers? It's really tough to say. Before we talk about all that, though, let me talk to you guys about LinkedIn Jobs as a small business owner or hiring manager. You know that success in 2023 all depends on the team members you surround yourself with. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. With LinkedIn Jobs, you can hire qualified candidates more efficiently by matching open roles with people who have the skills, values, and experiences to help you achieve your goals. LinkedIn Jobs helps you quickly attract qualified candidates, and they go beyond resume data by using insights from your job post, your company, and 875 million member profiles on LinkedIn to put your post in front of the best people. Identify the most qualified candidates on LinkedIn Jobs, connect with them fast and for free. LinkedIn Jobs makes it easy to screen and rate applicants based on your job qualifications all in one platform. That's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, check out Locked On Hawks with Brad Rowland. I was going to actually have him on today to talk Hawks ahead of Pacers Hawks, but obviously this supersedes that much bigger story in Pacerland, the injury to Tyrese Haliburton. We can talk Hawks later in the season. These two teams play again at a later date. But Tyrese Haliburton being out, obviously the Pacers will have to adjust in several ways, but they haven't missed him very much this season. They've only missed him for 2 games. How did they adjust in those games? Well, they didn't score very much. 100 points on the dot in Portland, 112 the very next night in Golden State. They did not have a particularly potent offense in those games. Now, the Pacers' defensive rating this season actually a little better with Haliburton on the bench than on the court. So they might look a little better on D. That may be the way they can alter their identity to look like a capable team. But what is the specifics going to look like? Who should start at point guard? Who should move into the starting 5? How's this all going to tweak? Well, the first thing to note is we might not figure out all those answers right away because the Pacers play tonight against Atlanta, like I just said, and all the guys who missed the game in New York. O'Shea Brissett, he's questionable again with left hamstring soreness. Aaron Nesmith, he's questionable with that same illness that kept him out against the Knicks. Miles Turner with those back spasms, guess what? Still questionable. So if 1 or 2 or 3 of those guys are out, it's impossible to say how the Pacers adjust because not only will they be replacing Haliburton, but they have to adjust the entire rotation. If you assume, that the whole team, sans Tyson Brown, who've been out for a while, are healthy and available, right? Right now, just for the sake of this exercise, what could the Pacers rotation look like? Well, the first thing I wanted to do to try to figure this out is go back in time, right? The Pacers played those 2 games without Tyrese Haliburton. What did their rotation look like in those games? And what could it tell us they want to do without him? Well, there was one problem with that exercise, right? If you go back to that Portland game, they started Andrew Nembhard at point guard, and he did a pretty solid job, honestly, in both of those games that he started at the 1. We'll talk about him in a second. But the tricky part is TJ McConnell also was out for those 2 games that Tyrese Haliburton missed. He was out in Portland and Golden State with an illness. So the Pacers, remember, James Johnson was their backup point guard for a stint in the first half against Portland. Against the Warriors, they played Andrew Nembhard 42 minutes because they needed him out there for all of that. And the other 6 minutes, it was basically committee point guard of like Trevelyan Queen, Buddy Hield types to get by. Benedict Mathurin played 40 minutes in that game as well. You get the idea. But they only had 1 point guard back then. They only had 1 option. So it's not, you can't just look at that game and say, well, Andrew Nembhard started and say that's the idea. That said, I do think that is my prediction for what ends up happening is Andrew Nembhard assumes the starting point guard duties. Why? Because Carlisle's kind of history, and a lot of coaches like this in general, is they don't like to mess up units if they don't have to. And Andrew Nembhard already starts. So you don't change your second unit's identity and style that is led by TJ McConnell. If TJ McConnell comes to starting 5, you've now altered the starting 5 and the bench unit. Whereas if you just move Nembhard from the 3 to the 1, you're doing a little less of stylistic changes. So looking back on those games doesn't tell us that much because McConnell is out, but it does give me a hint and history of Carlisle, especially this season, for example, with Mathurin and starting Smith for a long time. Keeping guys in roles that they've played a lot and are getting used to is something that is valued with this franchise. But that is a guess. I am guessing that, to me, Andrew Nembhard will move from the starting 2 or whatever you want to call his position to the starting 1, but they still have to fill that spot somehow, right? And I think you could go a number of ways with this, right? For example, pretending everyone is healthy, Nembhard, Hield, Nesmith, Turner in the starting 5. Still, who's your 5th guy, right? If they stick with the small ball groups they have, and you call Nesmith the 4 and Buddy Hield the 3, maybe Ben Mathurin could be the new starter. And I think there is some merit to that. You need some shot creation with Haliburton out of the game. Benedict Mathurin can give you that. He can put the ball on the floor. He can get to the basket and create shots. When the Pacers played in Golden State, he was the starter that game. And Turner was out for that one as well, which is potentially noteworthy for tonight's game against the Hawks. In that game, they started Nembhard, Nesmith, Smith, Mathurin, Hield. The game before, they did have Turner in Portland, and it was Nembhard, Nesmith, Hield, Smith, Turner. So, again, that is one option. Is Mathurin moves in, they continue with the small ball lineups, and it's just Mathurin in for Haliburton, and Nembhard is now your first unit one. But then your bench is a little wonky, right? You've got McConnell creating for others, and Duarte maybe trying to self-create a little bit, but you're reliant on, Jalen Smith to maybe get some buckets in the post or something like that. Your guard depth being weakened is certainly impacting the second unit in this instance, and it'd be a little harder for the Pacers to get exactly who they want out on the floor. In that case, maybe Trevelyan Queen gets called up for a game or two, but they would lose a lot of creation with the second unit by starting Mathurin, significantly so, and he's done well in that role so far. If they want to balance the creation and have two, for example, say Buddy Hield's self-creation and Andrew Nembhard's creation for others in the starting five, they could perhaps go with Nembhard, Hield, Nesmith, and then the Smith-Turner front court that has started together so often. That could be the starting five, and then have the second unit be McConnell, Mathurin, Duarte, and then with Smith starting now, you'd assume Isaiah Jackson gets in there, or who knows, something to that effect makes sense to me as one way this could go. But there are a lot of ways. I think, though, that my prediction is that Nembhard's going to be the starting one, but we will see. Perhaps McConnell moves into the starting one, and then things go, seamlessly as they were with McConnell, Nembhard, Hield, Nesmith, Turner. But then, maybe Nembhard is the first sub that comes out for Mathurin, and then he comes back in to run the second unit for McConnell, and you stagger those guys. So one of them is out there at all times, right? There are so many ways that this could go that it's really impossible to predict, but the short of it is obvious, right? Nembhard and McConnell are going to be playing more often with the ball in their hands because Pacers need it. They don't have a point guard out there anymore. So in some shape or form, the way this will shake out, someone else is going to be inserted into the rotation. Odds-on favorites, Isaiah Jackson sneaking in some minutes there. Even if Nembhard becomes the backup one, there's going to be someone who moves down a position or slides a position that would lead to this is a guess, but I would imagine you would see more Isaiah Jackson minutes, especially because Kendall Brown's out, right? That is what I think it will happen. But we will see. I think that because the whole identity of the team is going to slightly change, a lot would not surprise me. There are a couple of things they could do that I would say, yes, that makes sense. That is a way that they can, be a little more effective with the new style they're going to have. So the follow-up question to how's the rotation going to change is who needs to step up and be better? Well, the two guys who are playing in his spot and playing more minutes, McConnell and Nembhard, need to be great, right? Halliburton accounts for about 40% of the team's assists on a given night, right? He's an amazing passer. But the long answer is everybody. Absolutely every single player. Because the engine of your offense is now gone. Creating shots is now that much harder. Running your sets, getting organized is now that much more challenging. Communication changes ever so slightly, right? Haliburton just has this sense for when guys need the ball, what plays need to be made, what matchups need to be exploited. He can read 3 steps ahead. And McConnell and Nembhard are good passers and good readers of the game. But very few people have the level of analysis that Haliburton has on the fly. And that makes everybody's life easier in a way that, well, like I said in the first segment, won't be the case as much now, obviously. And so everybody's going to have to be, better screens, better timing with their cuts, better communication. All those little things that matter a lot, even when Haliburton is playing, are almost doubly so important now as the team needs to step up and try to do as well as they can in this upcoming stretch without him. So I think a couple things is what you'll see here. Nembhard's going to get more reps on the ball as a creator. And quite frankly, he's deserved a chance to do this. It sucks that it comes in this way, but good for him as a way to develop as a rookie. Too, I think Benedict Mathurin is going to get more touches with the ball as well. He's a great self-creator, and with the Pacers now, Hield can sort of self-create, but Mathurin being good at it's going to be even more valuable without this electric three-point shooting threat who can, bend the entire defense in Haliburton. So those two guards, I think, will get, 3 guards really, but Nembhard and Mathurin seem like the guards who will get the biggest bump in usage, and the guy who will get the biggest bump in playing time. Nembhard and Isaiah Jackson seem like the winners of that, but that is just a prediction based on history, right? Jalen Smith could get a big bump in playing time if he becomes a starter, for example. So depending on how Carlisle decides to tweak things, maybe the Pacers still try to play fast. That would be harder without Haliburton, obviously, but if they keep the same identity, they'd probably keep a lot of the same lineups. And so, if so, how does that change their rotation? We'll see. Tonight we'll be telling. And the trouble is, though, if they're out, if Neesmith's out or Brissett's out or Turner's out, all of a sudden the snowball effect keeps rolling and rolling. That's why James Johnson and Terry Taylor and Goga Batadze all played so much in New York. If that's a thing going forward, everybody's role changes. Everything's different. It's much harder. So it's hard to say exactly what will happen until all three of those guys are back. But in the short term, my predictions are more Nembhard with the ball, more Mathurin with the ball, and slightly tweaked lineups to succeed with the talent that they have. Now, what about the team building side of this? Does this change the Pacers' trade deadline plans at all? Should it change their trade deadline plans at all? Let's talk about that to close today's show. Before we do, though, let me talk to you guys about BetOnline.net, your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from pro football to college bowl season to basketball and the World Cup. They've got it all at BetOnline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, you can find those on BetOnline as well. It's always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info, and you've got to check it out today. They've got all the odds up for Wild Card Weekend already. Buccaneers, Cowboys. Cowboys favored by 2.5 in Tampa Bay. Bengals favored by 9.5 against the Ravens, for example. All those lines and more at BetOnline.net. Go check them out. Head to that website today, or use your mobile device to learn more about BetOnline, because BetOnline is where the game starts. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, Locked On Sports Today. Go beyond the scoreboard, behind the scenes, for the biggest stories in sports with our local experts here at the Locked On Podcast Network, available on Odyssey, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Look, this is a natural consequence to this sort of thing happening on January 11th, is that everybody starts thinking, oh, wow, the trade deadline's February 9th. What does this mean for the Pacers, who are already a team that people have a lot of questions about around the league, right? What are they going to do? What makes sense for a team that's wildly exceeding expectations, has already reached, nearly exceeded their preseason win total number? What do they do now, right? And Jake Fisher, timing, reported in Yahoo this morning, right? Maybe they do want to be aggressive and accelerate their timeline a little bit because they're already better, because Haliburton's already good, right? Well, that is certainly something they could still do, right? I will lead by saying this. Because this is not a ligament thing, because it's, at least as reported now by the Pacers, not a ligament thing, because it seems like something that will allow him to play again this season, it could change nothing. And that is the boring answer, right? It could be a short enough thing, and the Pacers have other point guards on the roster. They've won one game without Haliburton before this season. Maybe it's something where they see how it goes and just stay the course, stick with the plan that they had before the season started. I do think there's a lot of merit to that. But I will say the Pacers have been kind of gifted an opportunity by the timing here, right? This did happen before the trade deadline, right? I was on JMV on 1075 The Fan when this was dropped, and one of the questions John asked me was, about this, right? Do you think this impacts the Pacers' plans around the deadline? And I kind of think, the answer could still end up being no, right? They had this new long-term approach they came up with before the season, and they can accelerate their timeline in a way and still think long-term, right? If you get young guys who are already good and cost more assets, right? I've talked about that a little bit on the show before. But either way, thinking long-term is still possible with this injury, but it might change how they go about it, right? It might depend on what this stretch looks like. And the reason I say it's an opportunity because before the deadline is it gives you time to evaluate your team right now and your record and what your outlook looks like. For example, right? Just a simple look at the standings tells you the Pacers still in the play-in spot right now. I almost just said playoffs, which should have totally ruined my point. Pacers in the play-in right now. Half a game ahead of the Heat for the 8th seed, but well ahead of the Hawks, who they play tonight, who are in 9th, right? 3.5 games ahead of the Hawks. There are 4 games ahead of the 10th place Bulls and the 11th place Raptors, right? That's a big lead right now. So let's say they go, I don't know. I can't tell you how long Haliburton's out for, but let's say they win 40% of their games while he's out, and they come out of this in 8th in the East with a 1 or 2 game lead on, Atlanta, Chicago, Toronto. Is that comfortable enough for the Pacers to still accelerate their timeline and go with the course? And, they're a 55% win percentage team with Tyrese Haliburton. Can they get right back to that and be a strong playing team? Maybe that's something they're okay with, right? And so if they do well enough, 40% is not good, but you're talking about like just shy of a Wizards level team. without Tyrese Haliburton. 40% win percentage team. If they can be that without him, I don't think this would change their plans much. But the other flip side is, let's say they're great without him. Then there's a third thing to this too. There's a lot of ways this could go. If they're great without him, right? They Haliburton returns and they're still 7th. They're right there with the Knicks, right? Those two teams are tied in the standings right now, although the Knicks have the tiebreaker at the moment. Then yeah, I think that they would stick with the, as reported by Jake Fisher, accelerated timeline, right? Try to get better pieces this season that can still be long-term fits with this franchise. And so I think as long as they can kind of stay the course of what they've done, I don't think it changes too much. Unless it reveals, for example, that, Mathurin isn't quite, let's say Mathurin ends up being the new starter. And with that unit and with more responsibilities, he's not looking as good, or he's not quite up for the task. Maybe they say, let's stick the course this year. Let's not accelerate anything, right? Or Nembhard isn't ready to be, an everyday point guard kind of player, right? You can learn a lot of these things about those players, even if they win at a decent clip in the coming weeks. But there is also the factor of, look, like I said, they have a hard schedule for the next month, right? They play tough teams for their next 20 days, 2 weeks, what month, till the All-Star break, whatever stretch of time you would like to use to define when you think Tyrese Haliburton is going to be out. Look at the schedule yourself and figure it out, but they have a tough schedule. It's not ridiculous to think that the Pacers, without their best player, do not do as well in the upcoming games. Now, look, they beat Golden State without him. They played awesome defense in that game. Perhaps this team becomes a much better defensive team in the next couple weeks and figures some stuff out on that end of the floor and totally survives this, right? They've shown that they can do that. They beat the defending champs doing that already this season, right? It's not out of the question that it happens, but it's also not out of the question that they just kind of stink. It's possible that is something that happened to them. That game they lost in Portland, Miles Turner was really good, right? He made 10 shots. Andrew Nembhard had like 17 and 8. I had the box score up and I closed it because I didn't think I needed it for this segment. They only scored 100 points still, despite those two guys playing well and being on the same page, right? Sometimes it's like the starters were good. Nembhard was good. Turner's good. But oftentimes when you lose a good player like this, the direct replacement for them can kind of give you what they give you. They're a worse player, but it's the guy replacing that replacement is where the drop-off is a lot of the time. And so maybe the Pacers' second unit's much worse. There's a lot that could change for the Pacers. I'm kind of rambling to say there's not a ridiculous chance that the Pacers just become a crappy team without Tyrese Haliburton, right? Let's say they win 30% of their games, right? 3 out of every 10. So they'd go 3-7 in their next 10 games. And then all of a sudden they're 26-26, right? That would put them very close to the Hawks, Bulls, Raptors win percentage. Or it's even more than 10 games. It's 12 games. It's 14 games, whatever. And they go 4-10 or 5-9. And all of a sudden they're under 500, right? They're closer to those teams. They're closer to the back of the plan. Then maybe they think longer term. Maybe that influences the front office at the trade deadline. Well, we were having a good year, but our circumstance is different now. Even if we go for it, we're not getting out of the situation we're in, right? We're too far from 6th. The Knicks have done well in this stretch. The Knicks are a team to watch, certainly, going forward. I think the top 5 in the East are pretty well set, right? Even the Pacers, who are tied with the Knicks, are 2.5 out of 5th and 3 out of 4th. Like, the tiers have kind of been settling. If the Pacers get pretty far from the Knicks, who are the 6th seed right now, firmly entrenched in that final playoff spot, or maybe Miami goes on a run right there in that mix as well. If they get pretty far from those teams in the stretch without Tyrese Haliburton and before the deadline still, I think it might influence the team, and it should be a data point they use to think longer term, like they suggested before the season. Yes, their start was awesome. They were a great team for the first half of the season, but their hand has changed. The hand they were dealt is different. They do not have Tyrese Haliburton for the next couple weeks, and that certainly could change their trade deadline approach. But I think that the way it would change it is not dependent on him playing or not. It's dependent on the results of the games without him, and specifically the players who have bigger roles, what they look like. Does that change what the team feels like they need? Does that change the structure of this team? Does that change the way they approach team building? Tons of other stuff in that Fisher report that I probably would have talked about today had this not dominated the show. In terms of guys who could be dealt, positions the Pacers are potentially going to pursue at the deadline, and it's the position that they've needed for years and years and years, so it's not surprising, but I highly recommend you read it in Yahoo Sports. Either way, it's going to be a very revealing couple of weeks coming for the Pacers without their best player. We'll cover everything you need to know about it here, of course, on the Locked On Pacers podcast next Monday. Of course, we'll talk about the games this weekend, Hawks and Grizzlies in town. And then we'll also be talking about what the team changed without Haliburton. What did it mean for them? Is this something that they look awful? Do they look fine? Do they look good? All sorts of ripple effects coming from this. And of course, you can get it here at the Locked On Pacers podcast, on Twitter at Locked On Pacers, and I on Twitter at TEastNBA. Thank you guys a ton for listening. Have an excellent weekend. We will see you on Monday.